I'm coming now to a time when I wasn't in Ireland at all. I did make study of it afterwards, and I met the men who were out in 16, and I was very proud to call them friends. And while I gave due credit to all the men who went out there and fought in 1916, I said, from the military point of view, something else could be done. These men in 1916, who were the men that rescued this nation from eternal slavery and gave their lives for it, and who can't be bested, could make a mistake just as we made mistakes after them. And if anybody aspires to leading or being a part of another movement for freedom of this nation and its people from all the evils that are afflicting it, they'll have to realize that there is no man or no group of men has ever been superhuman. We all made our mistakes. We all learned from what we did. But the men in 16, I could never make out why went out to fight. Some 11 or 1,200 of them. I can't understand why their leaders, instead of going in to defensive positions, and if you get a map of Dublin and examine these defensive positions, you will see that they had a surprise. They got into the GPO, they got into the Stephen's Green, they got into Boland's Meadows, they got into all these places in a surprise. I can never make out why these men, or why their leaders, didn't make him attack 3 places and they had plenty of troops to do it, which, to my mind, would be easier than capturing a barracks in 1920-21. If they had gone for Dublin Castle as a real attempt, I know that there was some kind of an attempt there, but it was more or less, they're here and we go at them. They already had taken up defensive positions, but if they had gone there and gone for 2 barracks, they'd have got a vast amount of arms. They'd have got so many prisoners. They would have had these prisoners there. They should have gone for the telephone exchange. And they would have put all these troops out of action. They'd have the barracks occupied, they'd have their supplies, and perhaps they would be able to continue for a month or 2 longer than they did. Now, of course, there is one answer to that thing, and it is this, that the men of 16 went out to make a blood sacrifice.
After the 1916 Rising, the Irish Revolution continued. Sentiment towards the Empire waned and a new era began. As World War I ended, the Irish Republic was declared. The Irish Republican Army, the IRA, was formed, who would employ guerrilla tactics against the British forces. Thus began the era of the Irish guerrillas, who would fight for their nation's freedom from the shadows. Solohead Beg in County Tipperary would see the first ambush.
Well, Mr. Breen, would you tell us what you were doing on the day the first Dáil assembled?
On the 21st of January 1919, that was the day of Solid Big, and we captured the jelly line from the RIC, and I had the misfortune, which would you like now? I say it was fortune. You can cut it out if you want to afterwards. When the misfortune to kill 2 RIC men. That's what they claim started the war of independence. I don't know other people claimed other things, but I think it was the start.
Well, would you tell us about the ambush itself, what you did early in the morning, and how you spent the day leading up to the actual incident?
Waiting in a very cold quarry for it to come along, with scouts out watching for the convoy to come along there, and we expected 6 policemen to come with the as escort to and only 2 came. We had, I think, 8 or 9 men there altogether. We were willing to fight it out for it, but only 2 came and they got killed.
Over the last 250 years, the nature of war and conflict has experienced significant adaptations. From the time of 1815 and the Napoleonic Battle of Waterloo to the Somme and to the deserts of Iraq and Afghanistan, the strategy of fighting has changed. The requirement for greater numerical strength is less significant, while there is more focus on the strategic deployment of forces and battlefield tactics used. Having seen the weakness of large and often bloody battles, as well as the failing of the Easter Rising, the Irish Volunteers under Michael Collins, with the support of Richard Mulcahy, reorganised and retrained to fight for independence with tactics that increased their prospects of success. The development and success of these tactics were instrumental in the development of asymmetric warfare, and they demonstrated the ability to fight a superior force with a numerical weaker but well-trained, disciplined and equipped force.
In the south, troops were a familiar sight, searches a daily occurrence. The Dáil would need an army to push Britain out of Ireland. As British soldiers policed the streets, the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, was being organised in secret. Its strategy was to render the country ungovernable by demoralising the army and the police and paralysing the civil administration. The only tactic against a professional army was guerrilla war.
We had an elected government, and the British government of occupation had their army and their forces there, and we had to establish it, and lack of supplies and all that kind of thing. And the only way to do it was guerrilla warfare.
Practically an unarmed body of men fighting one of the biggest empires at that time in the world, armed to the teeth with tanks, guns and God knows what. There was nothing left to us except guerrilla tactics.
It was quite easy for us to do it because the people were with us. We had no enemies, only the British forces.
During the early stages, like police barracks were attacked and they were evacuated, at the corner they were evacuated, they were burned. And they had to pull back into more or less the stronger centres in the towns and places.
Michael Collins, Richard Mulcahy as his second in command, with Cathal Brugha, Dick McKee and others effectively led the IRA, coordinating actions nationwide. However, the war's decentralised nature meant limited control over local commanders like Tom Barry, Liam Lynch and Sean McOwen. The ambushes continued mainly in Munster, increasing the death toll. The British responded to the IRA's guerrilla campaign with a combination of force and political manoeuvring. They deployed the additional troops and police, including the notorious Black and Tans and auxiliaries, to suppress the insurgency. They also implemented harsh measures like martial law, curfews and reprisals against civilians, including murder.
But it had to work out that way because it was the British set the pace. Now, a more ideal thing would have been if the volunteers had been ready, and one night, while these fellows weren't expecting it, that their army barracks and their RIC barracks and all the rest of their barracks would have been attacked and taken by surprise. It didn't work out like that because the British were setting the pace, and so you had a start of the guerrilla warfare. When they came out, they were met in some places and there was an odd policeman shot. They came out with military and escorting the police, and that started another racket. The IRA themselves took over the offensive, and the softest job in West Cork anyway was the taking of Coast Guard stations, who each had rifles. These were an armed body, the Coast Guards at the period, and they were attacked by various units in West Cork. And so the thing developed until it came to a regular showdown.
The flying columns emerged as a key tactic for the IRA during the Irish War of Independence. Initially, they were small mobile units formed on an ad hoc basis, often in response to specific British actions. These early columns proved effective in ambushes and raids, but their lack of coordination and resources limited their impact. As the war progressed, the IRA recognised the potential of flying columns and began to formalise their structure and operations. They established dedicated units, typically consisting of 10 to 20 men, who were trained and equipped for guerrilla warfare. These columns were highly mobile, operating in rural areas where they could evade British forces and exploit their knowledge of the terrain. The flying columns relied on intelligence networks to identify targets and plan ambushes. They often coordinated with local IRA units to gather information and provide logistical support. Their tactics evolved to include hit-and-run attacks on British patrols, raids on barracks and government facilities, and targeted assassinations of key figures.
As killings and ambushes of the police and troops became commonplace, the Black and Tans began to take reprisals on those they suspected of harbouring the rebels. Creameries, so crucial to Ireland's dairy economy, were wrecked, like this one at Mallow. Houses were sacked and burnt. Suspects were shot. These reprisals convinced the Irish that Britain was unfit to administer Ireland and led them to support the IRA. The Black and Tans are remembered and hated to this day. Attacks on the Royal Irish Constabulary, the RIC, in the countryside had forced them back into the barracks in the towns. By mid-1920, 55 had been killed, and men were resigning mainly as a result of threats to their families at the rate of 200 a month.
Word got out that what they call the Caro gang had arrived here in Dublin. They were the cream of the British intelligence, and that they were living in civilian houses all over the city. And needless, I was a soldier, the men that was with me were soldiers. We never asked any questions. We got an order, we carried it out. Whether it was right or wrong, we carried out that order.
You've sent your boys out, haven't you? It's written on your face.
Less than a mile to number 38 Upper Mount Street. At exactly 9 o'clock, he knocked on the hall door. The maid opened the door. Biddy Byrne said he had an important message for one of the officers. The maid knew something was amiss and tried to shut the door, but they pushed past her and demanded to know where the officers were sleeping. She indicated the front room and a room at the back of the house. When one section rushed into the front room through the adjoining one, the officer in the bed, which stood before this fireplace, reached under his pillow for a revolver, but quickly changed his mind. They bundled him down to the room of his colleague, a room which would now be the death chamber. Both men were made to stand on the bed up against the wall.
On the morning of November the 21st, 1920, an elite assassination unit known as the Squad mounted an operation planned by Michael Collins, Director of Intelligence of the Irish Republican Army, IRA. Their orders were clear. They were to take out the backbone of British intelligence network in Ireland, specifically a group of officers known as the Cairo Gang. The shootings took place in and around Dublin city centre and resulted in 14 deaths, including 6 intelligence agents and 2 members of the British Auxiliary Force. Later that afternoon, Dublin were scheduled to play Tipperary in a one-off challenge match at Croke Park, the proceeds of which were in aid of Republican Prisoners Dependence Fund. Tensions were high in Dublin due to the fears of a reprisal by Crown forces following the assassinations. Despite this, a crowd of almost 10,000 gathered in Croke Park. Eyewitness accounts suggest that 5 minutes after the throw-in, an airplane flew over Croke Park. It circled the ground twice and shot a red flare, a signal to a mixed force of Royal Irish Constabulary, auxiliary police and military, who then stormed into Croke Park and opened fire on the crowd. Among the spectators, there was a rush for all 4 exits, but the army stopped people from leaving the ground, and this created a series of crushes around the stadium. Along the Cusack stand side, hundreds of people braved the 20-foot drop and jumped into the adjacent Belvedere sports ground. The shooting lasted for less than 2 minutes. The afternoon in Croke Park, 14 people, including one player, Michael Hogan from Tipperary, lost their lives. It is estimated that 60 to 100 people were injured. The names of those who died in Croke Park on Bloody Sunday 1920 were James Burke, Jane Boyle, Daniel Carroll, Michael Feary, Michael Hogan, Thomas Hogan, James Matthews, Patrick O'Dowd, Jerome O'Leary, William Robinson, Tom Ryan, John William Scott, James Tehan, Joseph Traynor. In 1925, the GAA's Central Council took the decision to name a stand in Croke Park after Michael Hogan.
We arrived here, as I told you, dark in the morning at 8 o'clock. It rained all night as we marched. We got here without anybody knowing it. We came across fields and through boreens, and the men were soaking wet. And in that last Sunday in November, in 1920, the day started to freeze on them. From 8 o'clock in the morning, they were in their positions, and they weren't allowed to lift their head in case they'd be observed. They had no food. They got nothing except some decent people in this house here sent down 1 bucket of tea and a basket of cake to them. But anyway, they lay there all day, and they waited and waited and waited. And just about 4 o'clock, before it got dark, I had more or less decided to withdraw, that they weren't coming. And it was an extraordinary thing that I said, I'll give them 10 minutes more. After 4 or 5 minutes, these fellows were signaled to us coming along. And I came up the road and shouted at them, get up the boreen and out of the way and gallop. And the grey horse galloped, got out of sight. And they were just out of sight when the first lorry came on. They saw me standing in the ditch, and they slowed until they came within about 30 yards, and they were going about 5 or 6 miles then, when a bomb was thrown at them. Fire was opened, the scrap was on. The first lorry zigzagged drunkenly down to where we were standing. It came to rest within 3 yards, 4 yards of the command post. And those are the Auxies that weren't killed or wounded. There was a couple of them killed, I think. They all leapt out on the road, and the fight was on. And the fight then became more or less a hand-to-hand fight. It was a bloody fight, it was a bitter fight, and a savage fight. But eventually, anyway, 9 of the Auxies lay killed on the road, and there was no surrender from that bunch. At this time, we had only 1 man killed. And the second lorry had come to rest down here. I heard these fellas shouting, we surrender, we surrender, we surrender. But we kept jogging on to them. We saw them, some of them throw their rifles away. And when they did, 3 of this section stood up, and 2 of them, the Auxies opened fire immediately on them. They killed them with revolver fire. They threw their rifles away, and they killed them. They were a short distance, 20 yards from them. They killed them with revolver fire. When they opened fire again, we kept jogging up, and we were not recognized by the second lorry of these fellas. We got within 30 yards of them, and we dropped, and I gave the order to fire. And I shouted at the same time to the section, keep firing and don't stop till I tell you. We wouldn't take prisoners after their false surrender and after killing 2 of our men. These fellows were all eventually killed. We took their arms, took their ammunition, took their notebooks. We left them their money and their brandy flasks, and we pulled them away from the lorries, their dead bodies, and we set fire to their 2 lorries just as it was getting dark. 1 down at the command post and 1 up here.
The boys of Kilmichael. So here to the boys of Kilmichael, those brave lads so gallant and true, who fought 'neath the green flag of Erin and conquered the red, white and blue.
As a small child in my nursery, I woke up to see the flames reflected through the north window on the wall, and I thought it was an aurora borealis, which we had seen the week before, and I called my father. It was between, I suppose, 8 and 9 o'clock at night. And he said, no, he said, it's the damn British burning Cork.
I was a fireman in a fire brigade, and I received a call to proceed to Edgelands Cross. And on our way out, we saw the fire in the Grand Parade. Part of Patrick Street burning, so we couldn't proceed any further.
They threw an incendiary into the city hall as a last gasp, and that went up with a terrific crash. We saw that going up because that was lit by gas.
And when we turned on the water, all the horses were all stabbed with paints and rendered them all useless.
Black and Tans had gone into Cork, first looting and then burning down part of the city centre. They had prevented firemen from dealing with the blaze.
Well, the black smoke was coming up for nearly a week up the hill. We were nearly suffocated.
It was immense. It was as bad as anything I've seen in the Blitz in London.
There's hardly a building left.
British liberal opinion was outraged by these reprisals. Asquith reflected, "Things are being done in Ireland which would disgrace the blackest annals of the lowest despotisms in Europe."
The year 920 ended with the grim shadow of Bloody Sunday still looming over the conflict. The assassination of British intelligence officers by the IRA in November triggered a cycle of violence, culminating in the massacre of civilians at Croke Park and the burning of Cork City. Despite the overwhelming force arrayed against them, the IRA remained undeterred. The Irish War of Independence raged on, marked by escalating violence and increasing tensions. The IRA intensified its guerrilla warfare tactics, ambushing British patrols, raiding barracks, and disrupting their operations. In response, the British forces retaliated with brutal reprisals, employing a scorched earth policy, burning homes and businesses, and carrying out extrajudicial killings. The British government, however, found itself in a quagmire. The war was becoming increasingly unpopular at home, and the mounting casualties and financial burden were taking their toll. The IRA's guerrilla tactics proved challenging to counter, and the prospect of a protracted conflict loomed large. Amidst the escalating conflict, talks began between representatives of the new Irish government and the British government. The prospect of a negotiated settlement offered a glimmer of hope. The war weariness on both sides had created an opportunity for dialogue. After months of tense negotiations, a truce was finally declared on July 11, 1921. The guns fell silent, and a fragile and short peace descended upon Ireland for a short time. This marked a pivotal moment in the struggle for independence, paving the way for further negotiations and the eventual Anglo-Irish Treaty. The escalating violence, the brutal reprisals, and the unwavering determination of the IRA eventually forced the British government to seek a resolution. The Empire just couldn't deal with the Irish guerrillas. Essentially, the British were beaten, their tactics had not worked, and the Irish intelligence and new form of warfare had brought them to seek peace. Michael Collins used quick raiding and hit-and-run tactics against the British Army, the Black and Tans, and the Royal Irish Constabulary. This was critical for his success because the Irish volunteers were outnumbered by the British, who were also better equipped. This meant that his forces were able to use the element of surprise within their operations to be successful. The column had the crucial advantage of surprise. The IRA was able to choose the time and place of attacks and had additional advantages of a detailed familiarity with the terrain. This allowed for effective ambushing and use of the element of surprise to degrade the enemy's morale, since it often left them in constant fear of attack, which would have affected their ability to fight and operate within the longevity of the conflict. The British constantly complained that they could not identify the enemy, and that the column men did not wear uniforms and merged imperceptibly back into the local community. Finally, the formation and operations of the active service units, known as the Flying Columns, developed by Michael Collins and the IRA brigade commanders, can be seen in later guerrilla warfare. The flying columns were involved in the majority of the raiding, for example the failed Custom House raid and the Kilmichael Ambush. Fighting against the British Army, the Royal Irish Constabulary, the auxiliaries and the Blackened Hands were spread across all areas in each county. One of the most successful and effective flying columns was commanded by General Tom Barry during the War of Independence. In total, British Army stationed over 12,500 troops in County Cork during the conflict, while Barry's men numbered no more than 310. Eventually, Barry's tactics made West Cork ungovernable for the British authorities. The role of the flying columns was to engage British troops and to make the area ungovernable for the British authorities, thus loosening their level of control and influence upon the local population. The Irish insurgency, like modern-day insurgencies around the world, were primarily anti-elite, anti-colonial, and against the enforced progress imperial powers trying to achieve through brutal wars. Collins and his guerrilla fighters used asymmetric warfare and demonstrated the ability to fight a superior force with a weaker but well-trained, disciplined and equipped force. Similar battles have been fought globally since, using Collins' tactics, various degrees of success, but with the same determination in the struggle for freedom, justice and equal rights.